The trucker's hands froze on the steering wheel, his coffee spilling across the dashboard as the massive German Shepherd emerged from the Montana darkness like a ghost. The dog wasn't running from something, it was running to something, carrying what looked like a blood-stained note clenched between its teeth. Jimmy Rodriguez had driven these highways for 30 years, but he'd never seen a dog travel alone at 3:47 a.m. with such desperate purpose. The animal's eyes held an intelligence that made his skin crawl, and when it dropped the crumpled paper at his feet, Jimmy's world tilted sideways. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "Please help me find my family. Jake Patterson. Sarah needs her daddy." His radio crackled to life as other drivers reported the same dog, the same impossible journey. Jimmy reached for the animal, but it was already gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness toward the distant mountains. What kind of hell had this dog escaped from? And why did it feel like something terrible was racing against time? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor May Patterson had always believed that silence was just another word for peace, but at 74, she was learning the difference between the two. The silence that filled Broken Arrow Ranch these days wasn't peaceful. It was empty, echoing through rooms that once buzzed with family laughter and her late husband Robert's gentle humming while he read the morning paper. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the October sun paint the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber, her arthritic fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that had grown cold an hour ago. The ranch stretched out before her like a living photograph. 50 acres of memories that she and Robert had built together over 47 years of marriage. Every fence post, every barn board, every weathered gate held a story. But stories, she'd discovered, weren't much company when you were the only one left to tell them. The cattle moved lazily across the pasture, their routine as predictable as her own. Feed them at dawn, check the water troughs, repair whatever the weather had damaged overnight. It was honest work, the kind Robert had taught their son Jake to appreciate before the boy had grown up and chosen a different path, one that led to desert wars and bottle-shaped demons that even a mother's love couldn't chase away. 2 years. That's how long it had been since she'd heard Jake's voice, since their last argument had torn through this kitchen like a tornado, leaving nothing but broken words and slammed doors in its wake. She still kept his bedroom exactly as he'd left it the day he'd enlisted at 18, patriotic and proud, before Afghanistan had sent him back broken in ways she'd never fully understood. The stack of unopened letters on the kitchen table seemed to grow heavier each day, all addressed in Jake's familiar handwriting, all bearing Denver postmarks, all too painful to read. Some were thick with what felt like photographs. Others were thin, probably containing nothing more than apologies she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. Her reflection in the window showed a woman whose steel-gray hair had grown thinner, whose blue eyes weren't quite as sharp as they used to be, though she'd die before admitting it to anyone. The macular degeneration was progressing faster than Dr. Morrison had predicted, blurring the edges of her world like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Soon she might not be able to manage the ranch alone, but accepting help meant admitting defeat, and Patterson women didn't surrender easily. The phone had rung 3 times that morning, bill collectors mostly, though she'd stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The bank had been patient about the property taxes, but patience, like everything else these days, had limits. $47,000. It might as well have been 47 million. She touched Robert's wedding ring, which still hung on a chain around her neck next to her own. "What would you do, old man?" she whispered to the silence. But Robert, for the first time in their long partnership, had no answers. Jake Patterson sat in his Denver apartment staring at the eviction notice taped to his door, the paper fluttering like a white flag of surrender in the October breeze. 3 days. That's all the time he had left before the landlord would change the locks and put his meager belongings on the curb. He crumpled the notice and let it fall to the floor, where it joined the collection of unpaid bills, termination letters, and empty bottles that had become the archaeological record of his spectacular failure as a human being. Kaiser lifted his massive head from his spot by the window, dark eyes tracking Jake's movements with the kind of unwavering attention that had once made him invaluable in the mountains of Afghanistan. The German Shepherd had been Jake's battle buddy for 18 months overseas, and in the 7 years since they'd returned stateside, the dog had never stopped watching over him, even when Jake stopped watching over himself. The phone buzzed against the coffee table, vibrating through the accumulated debris of his collapsed life. Lisa's name flashed on the screen for the 4th time in an hour. He knew he should answer. Their daughter Sarah was the one good thing he'd managed not to completely destroy. But every conversation with his ex-wife lately felt like another inventory of his failures. Another reminder that he wasn't the man he'd promised to become when he'd gotten down on one knee 8 years ago, full of hope and wedding plans and dreams that seemed laughable now. "You going to keep ignoring that, or are you going to man up and answer?" he asked himself, his voice hoarse from the bottle of Jack Daniels he'd polished off the night before. Kaiser's ears pricked forward at the sound, and Jake felt a stab of guilt. The dog deserved better than this. Hell, everyone in his life deserved better than this. The 5th call came, and this time Jake's finger hovered over the answer button. Through the thin apartment walls, he could hear Mrs. Chen next door watching her morning talk shows, the cheerful voices discussing recipes and home improvement projects, normal people living normal lives, the kind of existence that felt as foreign to him now as the Afghan villages where he'd spent his 19th and 20th birthdays. "Jake, please pick up." Lisa's voice came through the voicemail, and something in her tone, a crack, a tremor, made his blood go cold. "It's about Sarah. We're at Children's Hospital. The doctors— Jake, I need you here. Please." The phone slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor beside the eviction notice. Children's Hospital. The words echoed in his head like artillery fire, and suddenly he was moving, grabbing his keys, his wallet, not bothering to lock the apartment because what did it matter now? Kaiser was already at the door, military training kicking in, sensing the emergency before Jake had fully processed it himself. They ran down 3 flights of stairs, Jake's heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to process what could be wrong. Sarah had been fine last weekend when he'd taken her to the zoo. She'd laughed at the monkeys, held his hand during the seal show, drawn him a picture of the 2 of them standing in front of the elephant exhibit. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and prayer fragments, the kind of desperate bargaining with God that Jake had learned in foxholes and forgotten in bars. He left Kaiser in the truck with the windows cracked, promising to be back soon, knowing the dog would wait however long it took. The pediatric ward smelled like disinfectant and false hope. Jake found Lisa in the waiting area, her face pale and streaked with tears, still wearing the scrubs from her nursing shift at Presbyterian. She looked up when she saw him, and her expression cycled through relief, anger, and something that might have been forgiveness before settling on exhaustion. "She collapsed at school," Lisa said, without preamble. "During art class, the teacher said she just fell over. They brought her here in an ambulance." Jake sat beside her, noting the way she didn't pull away when their shoulders touched. "What do the doctors say?" "They're running tests, blood work, scans. Dr. Martinez thinks—" Her voice broke and she pressed her hands to her face. "Jake, they think it might be leukemia." The word hit him like an IED blast, sudden and devastating. Leukemia. Cancer. His 8-year-old daughter, who still believed in tooth fairies and asked him to check under her bed for monsters, might be fighting for her life. "How long before we know for sure?" His voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Tomorrow morning." maybe sooner." Lisa looked at him then, really looked at him, and he could see her cataloging the signs, the bloodshot eyes, the tremor in his hands, the smell of whiskey that clung to him like cologne. "Jake, I need you sober for this. Whatever happens next, Sarah needs her daddy, not—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The diagnosis came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would fracture Jake's world into before and after. Dr. Martinez, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes and steady hands, delivered the news with the practiced gentleness of someone who had shattered too many parents' dreams to count. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words hung in the sterile air of the consultation room like a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. Sarah sat between Jake and Lisa on the too-small couch, her thin legs swinging back and forth, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation happening over her head. She was coloring in a hospital-provided activity book, her tongue poking out in concentration as she carefully stayed within the lines of a smiling cartoon elephant. 8 years old and already fighting the battle of her life. "The good news," Dr. Martinez continued, "is that childhood all has a high cure rate when caught early. The challenge will be finding a bone marrow donor match. Family members are typically the best candidates, so we'll need to test both parents immediately." Jake's mind was reeling, but one thought cut through the chaos with painful clarity. His mother! Eleanor's blood type was O negative, universal donor, the same as his own. She'd mentioned it countless times over the years, proudly wearing her Red Cross donor pin, talking about how her blood could help anyone. If there was a genetic match to be found in their family, it would be her. But he hadn't spoken to his mother in 2 years. Not since that terrible night when he'd shown up at the ranch drunk and belligerent, ranting about the nightmares and the pills and the way the world felt like it was closing in on him. She'd tried to help, tried to understand, but Jake had lashed out with the precision of someone who knew exactly which words would cut deepest. "Your father would be ashamed," she'd said finally, her voice breaking. And Jake had responded with something unforgivable about how maybe it was good Robert was dead so he didn't have to watch his son fall apart. The slap had echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot, and by morning Jake was gone. Now, sitting in this sterile room watching his daughter color pictures of zoo animals, those words felt like acid in his throat. He needed Eleanor, but how do you call your mother after 2 years of silence and ask her to save your child's life? Lisa's test results came back first, not a match. The news hit her like a physical blow, and Jake watched his ex-wife crumble inward, all her nursing training and medical knowledge converging on the terrible reality that she couldn't save their daughter. When Jake's results proved equally useless, Dr. Martinez began discussing the National Bone Marrow Registry, statistical probabilities, and wait times that stretched into months they might not have. Jake left the hospital that afternoon with a head full of cotton and a heart full of broken glass. Kaiser was waiting in the truck, patient and alert, somehow sensing that everything had changed. The dog pressed his massive head against Jake's chest as Jake sat behind the steering wheel, not trusting himself to drive, not trusting himself with anything that mattered. "I have to call her," Jake whispered into Kaiser's fur. "I have to call Mom." But when he tried to dial Eleanor's number, his fingers wouldn't obey. Every time he started to press the buttons, he heard her voice from that night 2 years ago. "You're not the boy I raised. You're not the man your father was proud of." And his own response, the one that still woke him up in cold sweats. "Maybe that's because he's not here to be disappointed anymore." Instead, Jake did what he'd been doing for months. He drove to Murphy's Bar on Colfax Avenue and ordered a double whiskey, then another. The bartender, a grizzled man named Tony who'd seen every variety of human misery, didn't comment when Jake's hands shook too badly to hold the glass steady. He just kept pouring, and Jake kept drinking until the edges of the world blurred enough to be bearable. Kaiser waited in the truck through it all, loyal and patient in the way only dogs can be. When Jake finally stumbled out of the bar 3 hours later, reeking of whiskey and shame, the German Shepherd's expression held no judgment, only concern. It was that look, that pure, uncomplicated love, that finally broke something open in Jake's chest. He made it back to his apartment and collapsed on the couch, Kaiser settling beside him with the heavy warmth of a living anchor. The eviction notice was still crumpled on the floor, and Jake stared at it through his alcohol haze, thinking about how perfectly it summarized his life. Kicked out, cast off, unwanted. "She's going to die," he said aloud to the empty room. "My little girl is going to die because I'm too much of a coward to make a phone call." Kaiser whined softly and nudged Jake's hand with his cold nose. The dog had been trained in combat zones to detect danger, to alert soldiers to threats they couldn't see coming. Now he seemed to sense a different kind of threat, the darkness that was pulling his human deeper underwater with each passing hour. Jake reached for the bottle of pills on the coffee table, the ones prescribed for anxiety, but useful for so much more when taken in sufficient quantities. His hands were steadier now, and he found himself calculating dosages with the methodical precision of someone who'd considered this moment before. "I'm sorry, boy," he whispered to Kaiser. "I'm sorry I couldn't be better." But as Jake's fingers closed around the pill bottle, Kaiser did something unexpected. The dog clamped his powerful jaws around Jake's wrist, not biting but holding firm, and stared directly into his eyes with an intensity that cut through the whiskey fog. It was the same look Kaiser had given him in Afghanistan when incoming mortar fire was about to rain down on their position. A look that said, "Pay attention, stay alive, fight." In that moment, Jake understood something that would change everything. Kaiser knew, somehow this remarkable dog who'd saved his life overseas was trying to save it again, right here in a shabby Denver apartment that smelled like failure and broken dreams. Kaiser's grip on Jake's wrist was gentle but unbreakable, the kind of tactical hold the dog had been trained to use on enemy combatants who needed to be subdued but not injured. Jake stared into those dark, intelligent eyes and saw something that cut through his alcoholic haze like a blade: recognition. The dog knew exactly what Jake had been planning, and he wasn't going to let it happen. "Let go, boy," Jake whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Kaiser's response was to tighten his hold slightly and emit a low whine that somehow managed to convey both disappointment and determination. It was the same sound he'd made in Kandahar, when Jake had tried to walk point during a patrol despite having a fever of 103 degrees. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Jake opened his hand and let the pill bottle clatter to the floor, its contents scattering across the threadbare carpet like pharmaceutical confetti. Kaiser immediately released his grip and began nosing the pills away from Jake's reach, his tail wagging for the first time in days. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" Jake asked. And the dog's response was to trot over to the closet and drag out Jake's old military duffel bag, the one that still smelled like desert sand and gun oil. Inside, wrapped in a faded American flag, were Jake's deployment photos, his medals, and a stack of letters from home. Kaiser dropped the bag at Jake's feet and sat back on his haunches, watching expectantly. Jake's hands shook as he unwrapped the flag and pulled out the photographs. There was one of him and Kaiser on their first day in Afghanistan, both of them young and eager and completely unprepared for what was coming. Another showed the two of them with their squad outside a village school they'd helped rebuild after a Taliban attack. But the photo that stopped Jake's breath was one his mother had sent. Eleanor standing in front of Broken Arrow Ranch, holding a sign that read, "We're proud of you, Jake and Kaiser." Below the photos was Eleanor's last letter, the one that had arrived 3 days before Jake's final mission. the IED explosion that had ended their deployment and started Jake's long slide into darkness. He'd never opened it, couldn't bear to read words of love and encouragement when he felt like such a failure. Now, with Sarah fighting for her life and his own future hanging by a thread, Jake's fingers found the sealed envelope almost against his will. "My dearest son," the letter began in Eleanor's careful handwriting. "Your father and I watch the news every night. And while other families worry about their boys coming home different, we know you'll come home stronger. You've always been the kind of man who sees a problem and fixes it, who finds a way to help even when it costs him something. That's what makes us proud, not your medals or your service record, but the heart you carry into everything you do." The letter went on for 3 pages, full of news about the ranch and updates on neighbors Jake barely remembered, but it was the final paragraph that broke him. "Kaiser's mother, the German shepherd we had when you were little, used to bring us injured animals she'd found in the woods, rabbits with broken legs, birds with damaged wings. She'd lay them at our feet and look at us like she was saying, 'Fix this.' I think that's why Kaiser chose you as his partner. He recognizes a fellow rescuer. Come home safe, son. There are people here who need fixing, and you're just the man to do it." Jake was crying now, the kind of deep, racking sobs that felt like they might turn him inside out. Kaiser pressed against his side, offering the solid comfort of his presence while Jake finally grieved. For the war, for the marriage, for the father he'd never been, and the son he'd stopped trying to be. When the tears finally stopped, Jake felt hollowed out but strangely clear-headed for the first time in months. He looked at Kaiser, who was watching him with patient expectation, and suddenly understood what the dog had been trying to tell him. Sarah needed a bone marrow donor, Eleanor had universal blood and shared Jake's genetics. But more than that, Sarah needed her family whole again, not broken into pieces by pride and stubbornness and shame that had metastasized like its own kind of cancer. "You think I should call her?" Jake said to Kaiser. It wasn't a question. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Military dogs were trained to give minimal responses, but that single thump was equivalent to a full-body wiggle from a civilian pet. Jake picked up his phone, started to dial, then stopped. "How do you call your mother after 2 years of silence and ask her to save your child's life? How do you bridge a gap that wide with a single phone call?" His thumb hovered over Eleanor's contact information for a long moment before he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Her number was no longer in service. The recording was brief and impersonal. "The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service." Jake tried again, certain he'd misdialed, but got the same message. His mother, who had answered every phone call, returned every voicemail, and maintained the same landline number for 30 years, had disconnected her phone. Jesus, Kaiser. What if something happened to her? Jake's voice cracked as he imagined Eleanor lying hurt and alone at the ranch. Or worse, already gone, another casualty of his 2-year silence. He grabbed his laptop and searched for Eleanor Patterson in Billings, Montana, but found nothing recent. No obituaries, no hospital records, no trace of the woman who had raised him. Kaiser whined and paced to the window, then back to Jake, then to the door. The dog's agitation was palpable, and Jake realized that Kaiser was feeling the same desperate need for action that was building in his own chest. They needed to get to Montana. They needed to find Eleanor. And they needed to do it now, before Sarah's condition worsened and before Jake lost his nerve again. But Jake's car had been repossessed 3 weeks ago. He had $17 in his checking account, and Montana was a 12-hour drive away. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the debris of his collapse, trying to figure out how to perform a miracle with no resources and no time. That's when Kaiser did something extraordinary. The dog went to the corner where Jake kept his old military gear and began dragging items toward the door. His combat boots, his field jacket, and most importantly, the small backpack that contained Jake's emergency cash stash. Jake had forgotten about the money, $300 he'd hidden away during a brief period of sobriety 6 months earlier. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for gas and maybe a cheap motel room. "You want to go to Montana, don't you, boy?" Jake asked, and Kaiser's response was to grab his own leash and drop it at Jake's feet. The message was clear. They were going on a mission. Jake looked at the eviction notice, at the scattered pills, at the empty bottles that had been his constant companions for so long. Then he looked at Kaiser, who was standing at attention by the door, ready to follow his human anywhere, even into the possibility of redemption. "Okay," Jake said, his voice steadier than it had been in months. "Okay, let's go find Grandma." As they packed the truck, borrowed from Jake's friend Miguel in exchange for a promise to fix his transmission when they got back, Jake found himself thinking about Eleanor's letter again. She'd been right about Kaiser recognizing a fellow rescuer. But what she hadn't anticipated was that sometimes the rescuer needs rescuing too, and sometimes that salvation comes from the very person you've been too ashamed to face. The drive north began just after sunset, with Kaiser riding shotgun and Jake's hands steady on the wheel for the first time in months. They had 12 hours to cover 600 miles, and Jake found himself praying to a god he'd stopped talking to somewhere between Kandahar and Rock Bottom. Please let her still be there. Please let her forgive me. Please let us not be too late. Behind them, Denver's lights faded into the darkness, and ahead lay Montana, and answers to questions Jake wasn't sure he was ready to ask. But Kaiser's presence beside him was a reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite the fear, 1 mile at a time toward the people who needed you most. The last thing Jake saw in his rearview mirror was the city skyline where his daughter lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. The first thing he looked for on the horizon was home, a place he'd been running from for 2 years, but which might hold the key to saving everything he'd almost lost. The October wind cut through the Montana darkness like a blade, carrying the scent of snow and distant memories as Jake's borrowed pickup truck ate up the miles of Highway 94. Kaiser had been restless for the past hour, pacing back and forth across the bench seat, whining softly and pressing his nose against the passenger window. Something was wrong. After 7 years together, Jake could read his canine partner's signals like scripture, and right now every line of Kaiser's body screamed urgency. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, but his own hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. They were still 2 hours from Broken Arrow Ranch, and with each passing mile, Jake's imagination conjured increasingly horrific scenarios. Eleanor collapsed and alone, unable to reach help. Eleanor gone, undiscovered for days in the house that had become her prison. Eleanor, deciding that disconnecting her phone was the first step toward disconnecting from a world that had taken her husband and estranged her from her son. The truck's headlights swept across a familiar green sign. Billings, 127 miles. Jake's stomach twisted. He'd driven this route countless times as a teenager, usually racing back from some adventure in the city, always knowing that home waited for him at the end of the road. Now he wasn't sure what waited for him, or if anyone waited at all. Kaiser's whining grew more insistent, and he began pawing at the door handle with the kind of focused intensity he'd once reserved for detecting IEDs. Jake pulled over at a rest stop, thinking the dog needed to relieve himself, but Kaiser immediately began pulling toward the tree line, his nose working the air with professional precision. "What is it, boy?" "What do you smell?" The answer came in the form of distant howling, not the playful yipping of domestic dogs, but the wild, haunting call of coyotes. Kaiser's entire body went rigid, his ears pricked forward, his tail held high and still. In the moonlight, Jake could see his partner's expression shift from domestic pet to predatory wild animal. tapping into genetic memories that ran deeper than training or loyalty. More howling answered the first call, and Jake realized they were surrounded by a pack of coyotes moving through the darkness just beyond the reach of the truck's headlights. Kaiser growled low in his throat, a sound Jake had only heard twice before, once in Afghanistan when insurgents had been moving through their perimeter, and once in Denver when a man had tried to rob them outside a liquor store. "It's okay," Jake said, but he was already backing toward the truck. Coyotes rarely attacked humans, but a single man and dog in the middle of nowhere presented a different kind of vulnerability. As they climbed back into the cab, Kaiser's head swiveled to track the movement of shadows Jake couldn't see, his training asserting itself in ways that made Jake grateful for the Army's investment in military working dogs. They drove the next 50 miles in tense silence, Kaiser maintaining his vigil at the passenger window while Jake fought the urge to floor the accelerator. The borrowed truck was already pushing its limits, and breaking down in the middle of nowhere would help no one. But the encounter with the coyotes had awakened something primal in both of them, a recognition that they were entering territory where the rules were different, where survival depended on instincts older than civilization. When they finally turned onto the gravel road that led to Broken Arrow Ranch, Jake's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The familiar landscape looked alien in the darkness, fence posts leaning at wrong angles, pastures empty of the cattle that should have been there. And when the truck's headlights finally illuminated the farmhouse where he'd grown up, Jake's worst fears crystallized into horrible reality. The house was dark, completely dark. No porch light, no glow from the kitchen window where Eleanor always kept a lamp burning. No sign of life at all. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was overflowing with mail, and Jake could see newspapers scattered across the front yard like yellow leaves. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God, no." Kaiser was out of the truck before Jake had fully stopped, racing toward the front porch with the kind of focused urgency that meant he'd detected something. Blood, injury, death, Jake couldn't tell which. The dog disappeared around the side of the house, and Jake could hear him whining and scratching at what sounded like the kitchen door. Jake's legs felt like water as he climbed the porch steps. The front door was locked, but he still had his key. Eleanor had never asked for it back, probably hoping he'd use it someday. The house smelled stale and cold, like a place that had been closed up for too long. Jake fumbled for the light switch, and when the living room blazed to life, he saw something that stopped his heart. Eleanor's reading glasses were on the coffee table, folded neatly beside an open photo album. The pictures were all of Jake, his childhood, his high school graduation, his wedding day, his deployment ceremony. It was as if she'd been looking through memories of him before. Before what? Jake moved through the house like a sleepwalker, calling her name, checking rooms that echoed with emptiness. The kitchen showed signs of interrupted routine. A coffee cup in the sink, a half-eaten piece of toast on the counter, the newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle she did every morning. But no Eleanor. Kaiser had found the unlocked back door and was pacing back and forth across the kitchen, his agitation increasing by the minute. That's when Jake noticed the blood on the kitchen floor. Just a few drops, barely visible, but Kaiser had trained him to look for such things. The drops led from the kitchen counter to the back door, and when Jake followed the trail outside with a flashlight, he found more disturbing evidence. Broken glass from what looked like a coffee mug, disturbed gravel suggesting someone had fallen, and tire tracks that didn't match any vehicle Eleanor owned. "Someone took her," Jake said aloud, the words feeling like poison in his mouth. "Jesus Christ, someone came here and took her." Kaiser whined and nudged Jake's hand, then began moving purposefully toward the barn. Inside, Jake found Eleanor's truck still parked in its usual spot, keys hanging on their hook, gas tank full. Whoever had taken Eleanor, she hadn't gone willingly. She wouldn't have left her truck behind, wouldn't have left her coffee half-finished, wouldn't have abandoned the ranch without making arrangements for the animals. The animals! Jake's flashlight swept the empty pastures, and he realized that the cattle were gone too. All of them. 47 head of Angus cattle that represented Eleanor's life savings, her security, her connection to the land she and Robert had worked for nearly half a century. The scope of the theft was staggering. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity. This was calculated, organized, professional. Jake's phone had no signal this far from town, but the old landline in Eleanor's kitchen still worked. His hands shook as he dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered, the words tumbled out in a panicked rush. "My mother's been kidnapped." Eleanor Patterson, Broken Arrow Ranch on County Road 47. Her cattle are gone, there's blood on the kitchen floor, and she's been missing for God knows how long. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. "Sir, I need you to slow down. Can you tell me when you last spoke with your mother?" 2 years ago, Jake admitted, and the silence that followed felt like judgment. "Look, I know how that sounds, but something's happened to her. Her phone's been disconnected, her mail's piling up, there's blood in the kitchen." "Sir, are you Jake Patterson?" The question caught Jake off guard. "Yes, why?" "We've been looking for you. Your mother filed a missing persons report on you 3 weeks ago. She told us you'd disappeared from Denver and she was worried about your daughter, Sarah. When we couldn't locate you, we assumed you'd contacted your mother yourself." Jake's world tilted sideways. Eleanor had filed a missing persons report on him. That meant she knew about Sarah, knew about the leukemia, had been trying to find him while he'd been drowning in whiskey and self-pity. How did she know about Sarah? "I don't have those details, sir, but I can tell you that your mother was very concerned about both you and her granddaughter. She left several messages asking us to expand the search to hospitals in the Denver area." The implications hit Jake like a freight train. Somehow, Eleanor had learned about Sarah's diagnosis. She'd been trying to reach him, trying to help, while he'd been planning to overdose on his apartment floor. And now, she was gone. Possibly taken by people who knew about her connection to Jake, to Sarah, to whatever desperate circumstances had brought Kaiser racing across 600 miles of darkness. Kaiser had been pacing throughout the phone call, but now he stopped at the kitchen window and began barking, sharp, insistent sounds that meant he'd detected an immediate threat. Jake followed the dog's gaze and saw headlights approaching down the long gravel driveway. "Stay on the line," Jake told the dispatcher. "Someone's coming." The headlights belonged to a sheriff's department cruiser, and Jake felt a momentary relief that help was arriving so quickly. But Kaiser's reaction suggested something different. The dog had positioned himself between Jake and the approaching vehicle, his body language screaming danger in a way that made Jake's combat instincts flare to life. As the cruiser door opened and a figure in uniform emerged, Jake realized that Kaiser's wariness might be justified. In war zones, sometimes the people wearing the right uniforms were exactly the ones you couldn't trust. And if Eleanor's disappearance was connected to something bigger than random crime, then everyone, including local law enforcement, had to be considered suspect until proven otherwise. Jake kept the phone pressed to his ear as the uniformed figure approached the house, and he made sure Kaiser stayed close. Whatever had happened to Eleanor, whatever forces had converged to threaten his family, Jake was done running from fights that mattered. Sarah needed her grandmother, Eleanor needed rescuing, and Kaiser was right. It was time for the rescuers to do what they did best. But as the sheriff's deputy knocked on the front door, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much more dangerous than a simple kidnapping. Something that would test every skill he'd learned in combat zones and every bond he'd forged with the remarkable dog who'd refused to let him give up. Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Cole stood on Eleanor Patterson's front porch with the kind of casual confidence that made Jake's military training sound alarm bells. The man was too comfortable, too familiar with the property layout, and when his eyes swept over Jake's face, There was a flicker of recognition that suggested this wasn't their first encounter, even though Jake was certain they'd never met. "Mr. Patterson," Deputy Cole said, removing his hat in a gesture that might have seemed respectful if not for the calculating look in his eyes. "We got a call about a possible break-in. Everything all right here?" Kaiser's growl was so low it was almost subsonic, a warning that vibrated through Jake's bones. The dog had positioned himself slightly in front of Jake, military working dog protocol for protecting his handler from potential threats. Jake kept his hand on Kaiser's head, both for comfort and control. "Someone took my mother," Jake said carefully, noting how Deputy Cole's expression didn't change at this news. No surprise, no concern, no immediate questions about when or how or by whom. "Her cattle are gone, too. The whole herd." "Well now," Deputy Cole said, stepping closer to the screen door, "that's quite an accusation. What makes you think Mrs. Patterson didn't just decide to take a little vacation? Sell off her stock? Woman her age, living alone out here. Maybe she decided it was time to move on." The casual dismissal of Eleanor's disappearance confirmed Jake's suspicions. This man knew exactly what had happened to his mother, and the fact that he was here, alone, at night, within an hour of Jake's arrival, suggested he'd been watching the property, waiting. "She wouldn't leave without making arrangements," Jake said, "and there's blood on the kitchen floor." Deputy Cole's hand moved to his service weapon, a subtle adjustment that Kaiser immediately tracked. The dog's muscles coiled like springs, ready to protect his human at the first sign of aggression. In Afghanistan, Jake had learned to trust Kaiser's instincts over his own judgment, and right now every line of the dog's body screamed danger. "You know what I think happened here?" Deputy Cole said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I think a deadbeat son came home looking for money, maybe got rough with his old lady when she wouldn't hand over the deed to this place. I think maybe that same son is trying to cover his tracks by pointing fingers at imaginary kidnappers." Jake's blood went cold. This man knew about his estrangement from Eleanor, knew about his financial troubles, knew enough about their family situation to construct a convincing frame job. "Who told you I was a deadbeat? Who told you anything about me? Small town, son. People talk. Especially about war heroes who come home and turn into drunks." Deputy Cole stepped closer, and Jake could smell tobacco and something else. Fear sweat, the kind of desperate odor that came from a man who'd gotten in too deep and couldn't find his way out. "Mrs. Patterson was real worried about you these past few weeks. Kept calling the station, asking us to check on you, find out if you were okay. Broke her heart when we told her about your little girl being sick." The mention of Sarah hit Jake like a physical blow. "How do you know about Sarah?" "Like I said, people talk. News travels fast when it involves local families." Deputy Cole's smile was cold and predatory. "Especially when those families owe a lot of money to the wrong kind of people." Jake's mind raced, piecing together fragments of information that suddenly formed a terrifying picture. Eleanor's disconnected phone, the missing cattle, the professional nature of whatever had happened here, and now a corrupt deputy who knew too much about his family's private business. "She borrowed money," Jake said, the pieces clicking into place. "The ranch was in trouble and she borrowed money from loan sharks." "Smart boy," Deputy Cole said. "Though it wasn't loan sharks exactly, more like investors. People who saw potential in this property thought it might make a nice development site. Your mother was stubborn about accepting their generous offers, so they helped her understand that cooperation was in everyone's best interest." Kaiser's growl deepened, and Jake felt the dog's muscles bunch in preparation for an attack. Military working dogs were trained to take down armed suspects, and Kaiser had successfully neutralized 3 insurgents during their deployment. But Jake also knew that using Kaiser as a weapon would cross a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. "Where is she?" Jake demanded. "Safe," Deputy Cole said. "For now." but her continued safety depends on your cooperation. See, these investors I mentioned, they know about your little girl's medical situation. They know how expensive cancer treatment can be. They're willing to help with those bills, maybe even fly in some specialists from overseas. All they need in return is your signature on a few documents. The extortion scheme was elegant in its cruelty. Eleanor was being held as leverage to force Jake to sign over the ranch, but the ultimate threat was against Sarah, an 8-year-old girl fighting for her life in a Denver hospital. The kind of people who would kidnap an elderly woman and threaten a sick child wouldn't hesitate to eliminate loose ends once they got what they wanted. "You're making a mistake," Jake said quietly. "You have no idea who you're threatening." Deputy Cole laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the empty ranch. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Jake Patterson, former Army specialist, dishonorably discharged after a psychological evaluation. Unemployed mechanic with a drinking problem and a dead-end future. The kind of man who'd do anything to save his daughter, even if it means sacrificing his mother's legacy. But as Deputy Cole spoke, Jake noticed something that the corrupt lawman had missed. Kaiser had been gradually repositioning himself, using training that went far beyond basic obedience. The dog was now positioned to attack from Deputy Cole's blind spot, and his handler had taught him to recognize certain verbal cues that would trigger immediate action. "You're right about one thing," Jake said, keeping his voice level and calm. "I would do anything to save my daughter. Absolutely anything." The word anything was Kaiser's attack command, modified and disguised but unmistakable to a dog who'd spent 18 months in combat zones learning to interpret his handler's instructions. Kaiser launched himself at Deputy Cole with the silent efficiency of a predator, 60 pounds of trained muscle and bone hitting the man in the chest and driving him backward off the porch. Jake was moving before Deputy Cole hit the ground, years of military training taking over as he disarmed the corrupt deputy and secured his weapon. Kaiser held the man pinned, teeth bared but not biting, maintaining control until Jake gave the release command. "Now," Jake said, kneeling beside the terrified deputy with the man's own gun pointed at his head, "you're going to tell me exactly where my mother is. And if you even think about lying to me, I'll let Kaiser show you what he learned about interrogating prisoners in Afghanistan." Deputy Cole's eyes widened as he looked into Kaiser's intelligent, predatory gaze and realized that he'd seriously underestimated both the man and the dog who'd just turned the tables on his carefully planned ambush. The corrupt lawman had expected to intimidate a broken-down veteran and his pet. Instead, he'd awakened something much more dangerous, a soldier and his battle-tested partner who would stop at nothing to protect their family. Deputy Cole's confession came in gasping fragments, each revelation more horrifying than the last. Eleanor had been taken to an abandoned mining facility 30 miles north of the ranch, where a criminal organization led by a man named Vincent Russo had been using kidnapping and extortion to acquire rural properties for development. The scheme was simple and effective. Target elderly landowners with financial difficulties, apply pressure through corrupt local officials, and when persuasion failed, escalate to more direct methods. "She's alive," Cole wheezed, Kaiser's weight making it difficult for him to breathe. "But Russo's getting impatient. He knows about your daughter's condition, knows you'll sign anything to get help for her medical bills. The plan was to use your mother as leverage until you cooperated, then—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Jake could fill in the blanks. Jake's hands were remarkably steady as he zip-tied Cole's wrists with equipment from the deputy's own utility belt. The corrupt lawman had underestimated the psychological transformation that occurred when someone with military training switched from victim to hunter. Jake felt the familiar cold clarity settle over him, the same mental state that had kept him alive through 18 months of combat operations. "How many men does Russo have at the mine?" Jake asked. "4, maybe 5. Look, Patterson, you don't understand what you're dealing with here. These people have connections all the way up to the state level. You can't just— Kaiser, watch him, Jake commanded, and the German Shepherd immediately shifted position to maintain control over their prisoner. Jake walked to Eleanor's kitchen and called 911 again, this time asking for FBI jurisdiction due to the interstate nature of the criminal organization and the corruption of local law enforcement. While waiting for federal agents to arrive, Jake methodically prepared for what military tacticians called a direct action mission. He inventoried Eleanor's hunting rifles, checked ammunition supplies, and studied topographical maps of the mining area that he found in Robert's old geological survey files. The mine had been abandoned for 15 years, its access roads were poorly maintained, and the facility offered numerous defensive positions for anyone holding hostages. Kaiser watched these preparations with the focused attention of a dog who recognized pre-mission protocols. The German Shepherd had been trained for search and rescue operations in hostile environments, and his tactical abilities would be crucial for navigating the mine's complex layout while avoiding detection by Russo's men. The first FBI agent arrived just after midnight, followed by a tactical team from the Bureau's Denver field office. Special Agent Sarah Martinez was a compact woman in her 40s whose no-nonsense demeanor reminded Jake of the best officers he'd served under in Afghanistan. She listened to Jake's report with professional attention, asked pointed questions about Cole's confession, and immediately began coordinating a rescue operation. "Mr. Patterson, I understand your desire to be involved in your mother's rescue," Agent Martinez said as her team established a command post in Eleanor's living room. "But this is a federal operation now. We need you to remain here while we handle the tactical situation." Jake's response was calm and respectful, but absolutely firm. "Agent Martinez, with all due respect, I know that mine better than anyone on your team. I worked there 3 summers during high school, and Kaiser is trained in search and rescue operations in confined spaces. You need us." Agent Martinez studied Jake with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent years evaluating whether civilians could handle dangerous situations. She saw the steady hands, the tactical thinking evident in his mission preparation, and the remarkable bond between man and dog that suggested genuine operational capability. "Former military?" she asked. "Army specialist, deployed to Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division. Kaiser was my military working dog partner." Jake's voice carried no boasting, just factual information delivered with professional precision. Agent Martinez made a decision that would later be debated in FBI training seminars. "All right, Mr. Patterson. You and Kaiser can accompany the tactical team, but you follow orders absolutely. This isn't a combat zone, and we're not the Army. Our primary objective is bringing everyone home alive." The drive to the mine took 45 minutes through mountain terrain that tested the FBI's suburban vehicles. Jake rode in the lead tactical van with Kaiser beside him, both of them falling into the familiar rhythm of pre-mission preparation. Kaiser seemed to understand that they were approaching a situation requiring his specialized skills, and his demeanor shifted from domestic pet to professional working dog. The Copper Creek Mine had been one of Montana's most productive facilities until environmental regulations and declining ore prices forced its closure in 2008. The main facility consisted of administrative buildings, equipment sheds, and 3 separate mine shafts that descended into a network of tunnels extending deep into the mountain. Jake remembered the layout from his teenage summers: the main office where payroll was distributed, the equipment garage where miners stored their gear, and the foreman's shack that offered commanding views of the entire facility. Agent Martinez's thermal imaging equipment showed heat signatures in the main office building. 5 people, 3 of whom appeared to be moving freely, while 2 remained stationary. The stationary figures were likely Eleanor and possibly another hostage, while the mobile signatures represented Russo's security team. "We go in quiet," Agent Martinez whispered into her throat microphone. Team Alpha takes the main building, Team Beta secures the perimeter, and Patterson with Kaiser provides reconnaissance through the mine tunnels in case they try to move the hostages underground. Jake and Kaiser entered the mine through a ventilation shaft that Jake remembered from his high school job. The German Shepherd's night vision was superior to any technological equipment, and his ability to navigate by scent would be crucial if the hostages had been moved through the tunnel system. They descended into darkness that smelled of rust, stagnant water, and something else. Fear, sweat, and human waste that suggested people had been confined in these tunnels for an extended period. Kaiser's behavior changed as they moved deeper into the mine. The dog's ears pricked forward, his nose working the stale air with intense concentration. He was tracking multiple scent trails, some old and some very recent, but it was his sudden stillness that alerted Jake to immediate danger, the kind of frozen alertness that meant hostile contacts were nearby. Jake heard the voices before he saw the men, two of Russo's security team discussing guard rotations and complaining about the smell from the hostages' makeshift prison. They were positioned near what Jake remembered as the mine's main junction, where several tunnel systems converged. Through Kaiser's reactions, Jake could tell that Eleanor was close, probably in one of the equipment storage areas that had been converted into holding cells. The tactical situation was complex. Jake could hear Agent Martinez's team beginning their assault on the main office building through his radio earpiece, but that would likely trigger Russo's contingency plan to move or eliminate the hostages. Jake had minutes, maybe less, before the underground guards received orders to take irreversible action. Kaiser looked at his handler with the kind of intelligent expectation that had made him invaluable in Afghanistan. The dog was waiting for instructions, ready to execute whatever plan Jake devised, trusting completely in their partnership. In the darkness of the mine tunnel, Jake felt the same surge of clarity and purpose that had carried him through the worst moments of his deployment. But this time, the stakes were personal. This wasn't about securing a village or protecting fellow soldiers. This was about saving the woman who'd raised him, who'd never given up on him even when he'd given up on himself. Eleanor was somewhere in these tunnels, probably terrified, possibly injured, but still alive, still waiting for someone to find her. Jake made his decision with the cold calculation of a soldier who understood that hesitation could be fatal. He signaled Kaiser to maintain silence and began moving toward the voices, using skills he'd hoped never to need again, but grateful he'd never lost. The rescue operation was about to become very personal, and Vincent Russo was about to learn what happened when you threatened the family of a man who'd been trained by the U.S. Army to find people who didn't want to be found. In the distance, Jake could hear the muffled sounds of the FBI's assault beginning. Time was running out, and everything depended on the next few minutes. Jake found Eleanor in a storage chamber that had been converted into a makeshift prison cell, her wrists zip-tied to a support beam, her face bearing the bruises of rough handling, but her eyes still blazing with the fierce independence that had defined her entire life. She looked up when Kaiser's nose appeared around the corner of the tunnel entrance, and Jake saw something he'd never expected to see in his mother's expression. Relief so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "Jake," she whispered, her voice hoarse from days of captivity. "Is that really you, son?" "It's me, Mama," Jake said, the childhood endearment slipping out naturally as he cut her restraints with his tactical knife. "Kaiser brought me home." Eleanor's hands went immediately to the German shepherd's head, stroking his ears with trembling fingers. "I knew he would," she said. "I've been telling him about you for days, about Sarah, about how much we need you to come back to us." Smart Dog knew exactly what to do. Jake helped Eleanor to her feet, noting that she was dehydrated and weak, but seemed to have avoided serious injury. "We need to move quickly," he said. "The FBI is hitting the main building right now, and when Russo's men realize they're trapped, they might come looking for you." But as they started toward the tunnel entrance, Jake heard footsteps echoing through the mine shafts, heavy boots moving with purpose, voices calling out orders in the kind of sharp, urgent tones that meant the situation above ground had gone badly for the criminal organization. Vincent Russo's contingency plan was already in motion, and Jake realized they were about to be trapped between federal agents who didn't know their exact location and desperate criminals who would use Eleanor as a human shield. "This way," Jake whispered, leading Eleanor deeper into the mine instead of toward the surface. Kaiser took point, his superior hearing and night vision making him the perfect scout for navigating the labyrinthine tunnel system. Jake's teenage summers working in these mines had given him knowledge that no FBI briefing could provide. Knowledge of forgotten access shafts, emergency exits, and the peculiar acoustics that could either hide or reveal their presence to pursuers. The sound of gunfire echoed down from the main facility, sharp cracks that reverberated through the rock and indicated that Agent Martinez's team had encountered resistance. Jake counted muzzle flashes and tried to calculate odds. The FBI had superior numbers and training, but Russo's men had defensive positions and intimate knowledge of the facility layout. More importantly, they had nothing to lose. Getting captured meant life sentences for kidnapping, extortion, and corruption charges. Eleanor was struggling to keep pace despite her determination to stay quiet and not slow them down. Jake could see that her ordeal had taken a greater physical toll than she was willing to admit, and he made a tactical decision that went against every principle of small unit operations. He stopped running and prepared to make their stand in a chamber that offered both defensive cover and multiple escape routes. "Mama, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Jake said, helping Eleanor sit against a rock formation that would provide protection from gunfire. "There are some things I need to tell you. Things I should have said 2 years ago before I let my pride tear our family apart." Eleanor's eyes widened. Even in their desperate circumstances, she understood that her son was preparing for the possibility that they might not survive the next few minutes. "Jake, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Jake interrupted. "I need you to know that Sarah is the most amazing little girl you'll ever meet. She draws pictures of you even though she's never seen you. She asks about her grandma Ellie every single day, and she's fighting leukemia with the same stubborn strength that you taught me to have." Eleanor's hand went to her throat, and Jake could see the devastating impact of learning about her granddaughter's illness under such circumstances. But there was something else in her expression, a fierce determination that reminded Jake why Eleanor Patterson had never lost a fight that truly mattered to her. "That's why you came home?" Eleanor said. "It wasn't a question. You need a bone marrow donor." "I came home because Kaiser wouldn't let me give up," Jake said. "He knew what I was too proud and too scared to admit. That family is the only thing that matters when everything else falls apart. I came home to ask your forgiveness and to tell you that I love you more than I've ever been able to say." The footsteps in the tunnels were getting closer, and Jake could hear voices calling out in accented English. At least one of Russo's men was foreign, probably European based on the vocal patterns. Professional muscle imported specifically for this operation, which meant they were dealing with a criminal organization that had international connections and serious financial backing. Kaiser's posture changed subtly, shifting from reconnaissance mode to attack readiness. The dog had detected immediate threats moving toward their position, and Jake knew they had maybe 60 seconds before the shooting started. He checked his weapon, Eleanor's hunting rifle, loaded with 5 rounds of .308 ammunition that would be devastating at close range, but wouldn't provide much sustained firepower against multiple attackers. "I forgave you before you ever left," Eleanor said quietly. "I was angry and hurt and scared of losing you the way I lost your father, but I never stopped loving you, not for one single day." The first criminal appeared at the tunnel entrance. flashlight beams sweeping the chamber as he searched for the hostage he'd been ordered to secure or eliminate. Jake had the tactical advantage of darkness and defensive position, but shooting meant revealing their location to other pursuers and potentially triggering a firefight that Eleanor wouldn't survive. Kaiser made the decision for him. The German Shepherd launched himself at the armed man with the silent efficiency that had made him legendary among the soldiers who'd served with him in Afghanistan. The criminal's weapon discharged harmlessly into the tunnel's ceiling as 90 pounds of trained muscle drove him backward into the rock wall, and Jake was moving before the man hit the ground. The second attacker appeared just as Jake reached the tunnel entrance, and this time Jake didn't hesitate. The .308 round took the man's center mass, the report echoing through the mine shafts like thunder. Jake stripped the fallen criminal's weapon, a military-grade assault rifle with a full magazine, and prepared for the tactical situation he'd hoped to avoid. "Stay down, Mama," Jake called over his shoulder as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. Russo's remaining men had converged on their position, and Jake found himself in a firefight that reminded him uncomfortably of Afghanistan. Except this time, he was protecting his mother instead of fellow soldiers. Kaiser had taken cover behind a rock formation and was watching Jake for hand signals, ready to execute whatever tactical maneuver his handler commanded. The dog's military training was evident in every line of his posture. This was what Kaiser had been bred and trained to do, and he was completely in his element despite the chaos of combat. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through Jake's radio earpiece. "Patterson, what's your status? We're hearing gunfire from the mine tunnels." 3 hostiles down, at least 2 still active, Jake reported while changing magazines. "We're in defensive positions in Tunnel System C, approximately 200 meters from the main entrance. Eleanor Patterson is with me in ambulatory. Hold your position. We're sending tactical teams down through multiple access points." But Jake could hear something in the distance that made his blood run cold. The distinctive sound of drilling equipment being activated. Russo, or one of his men, was attempting to seal the mine entrances, trapping everyone inside while the criminal leader made his escape. The rescue operation had become a race against time, and Jake realized that saving Eleanor might require the kind of desperate action that only a soldier and his combat-trained dog could execute. He looked at Eleanor, who was watching him with the same expression she'd worn when he'd left for Afghanistan, proud, terrified, and completely confident that her son would find a way to bring everyone home safely. "Kaiser," Jake said quietly, "time to show them what we learned about fighting in the dark. Sometimes the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the courage it takes to come home." Jake Patterson thought he'd lost everything. His family, his purpose, his reason to keep fighting. But when his daughter Sarah faced a battle for her life, an extraordinary German shepherd named Kaiser showed him that love doesn't give up, even when we give up on ourselves. In the darkest tunnels of an abandoned mine, with his mother Eleanor's life hanging in the balance, Jake discovered that family isn't just about blood, it's about the unbreakable bonds that bring us back to each other, no matter how far we've strayed. This story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, that forgiveness heals the deepest wounds, and that sometimes our most loyal companions have 4 legs and hearts bigger than our fears. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized family forgiveness was more powerful than pride? What animal companion has shown you the true meaning of unconditional love? Share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear about the relationships that brought you home. The gunfire had stopped, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than the chaos of combat. Jake pressed his back against the cold mine wall. Eleanor huddled beside him, while Kaiser maintained watch at the tunnel entrance, every muscle in the German shepherd's body coiled with the tension of a predator waiting to strike. The drilling sounds had grown louder, more urgent, and Jake realized they were running out of time before Vincent Russo's men sealed them permanently underground. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through the radio with increasing desperation. "Patterson, we've lost contact with two of our tactical teams. The main entrance has been compromised with explosive charges, and they're attempting to seal secondary access points. We need your exact location for emergency extraction." Jake studied the hand-drawn mind map he'd found in Eleanor's papers, trying to calculate distances and elevations that might provide alternative escape routes. His teenage summers working in these tunnels had taught him about ventilation shafts and emergency exits that weren't included in official blueprints, but accessing them would require navigating through areas that Russo's men were likely using for their own escape. "There's an old air shaft about 300 meters north of our position," Jake radioed back. "It connects to the surface through a camouflaged exit near the equipment shed. But we'll have to cross through the main tunnel junction to reach it." "Negative on that route," Agent Martinez responded. "We have visual confirmation of at least 3 hostiles positioned at the junction. They're using it as a choke point while their leader attempts to collapse the entire tunnel system." Eleanor's hand found Jake's arm, and he could feel her trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. "Son," she whispered, "there's something you need to know about why they took me. It wasn't just about the ranch." Jake's attention sharpened. Even in their desperate circumstances, Eleanor's tone suggested information that could change everything about their tactical situation. "What do you mean?" "Vincent Russo isn't just some land developer," Eleanor said. "He's Sarah's father." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Lisa was 17 when she worked summers at the ranch," Eleanor interrupted. "This was before you two started dating, before you knew each other. Russo was using a different name then, calling himself Vincent Ross, claiming to be a geological surveyor. He got Lisa pregnant and disappeared when she told him about the baby. She never told you because she was ashamed, and she never told Sarah because she wanted her to have a father who actually cared about her." Jake's mind raced through the implications. Sarah wasn't just his stepdaughter. She was the biological child of the man who had kidnapped Eleanor and was currently trying to kill them all. The custody battle, the medical expenses, the carefully orchestrated pressure that had driven Jake to the breaking point, all of it had been Russo's way of manipulating his daughter's life from the shadows. "He knows about Sarah's leukemia because he's been monitoring her medical records," Eleanor continued. "When he learned about her need for a bone marrow donor, he saw an opportunity to claim his biological rights while eliminating everyone who knew the truth about his identity." Kaiser's growl cut through their whispered conversation. The German Shepherd had detected movement in the tunnels, multiple contacts approaching their position with the coordinated precision of military operators. Jake grabbed Eleanor's hand and helped her to her feet, knowing they had seconds before the final confrontation began. "Agent Martinez," Jake called into his radio, "I need immediate backup at Tunnel Junction C7. We're about to be overrun, and I have critical information about Vincent Russo's identity and motives." But the radio only returned static. Either the FBI team was too far underground to maintain communications, or Russo's men had found a way to jam their signals. Jake and Eleanor were on their own, with only Kaiser and a handful of ammunition between them and a criminal organization that would stop at nothing to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. The first explosion shook dust from the tunnel ceiling and sent shockwaves through the rock that Jake could feel in his bones. Russo was beginning the systematic destruction of the mine, starting with the access points that might allow law enforcement to follow his escape route. Each successive blast would bring them closer to the junction where Jake, Eleanor, and Kaiser had made their stand. "This way," Jake said, leading Eleanor deeper into the mine instead of toward any of the known exits. His teenage exploration of these tunnels had revealed a natural cave system that connected to the mines through a series of narrow passages that would be nearly impossible for armed men to navigate but might provide their only chance of survival. Kaiser seemed to understand their desperate plan immediately. The German Shepherd had been trained in confined space operations during his military service, and he took point without hesitation, leading them through passages so narrow they had to crawl single file through spaces that felt like stone coffins. Eleanor struggled with the physical demands of their escape route, but her determination never wavered. "Jake," she gasped during a brief rest in a wider section of the cave system, "if we don't make it out of here, I need you to know something about your father. He left you a letter before he died, but I was too angry and hurt to give it to you. It's in the safe at the ranch. Combination is your birthday." "We're getting out of here," Jake said firmly. "All of us. And when we do, you're going to meet your granddaughter, and she's going to learn that she has the strongest grandmother in Montana." But even as Jake spoke those words of confidence, he could hear Russo's men getting closer, their flashlight beams beginning to penetrate the darkness of the cave system. The criminal leader had obviously anticipated that Jake might know about alternative escape routes, and he'd positioned his remaining men to cover every possible exit. Kaiser's ears pricked forward, and the dog's expression changed in a way that Jake had learned to recognize during their combat deployments. The German Shepherd had detected something that his human senses couldn't perceive: fresh air, the scent of the surface world, a way out that wasn't marked on any map or blueprint. Following Kaiser's lead, they crawled through a passage so tight that Jake's shoulders scraped against stone on both sides. Eleanor was struggling to keep pace, her breathing labored and her movements increasingly unsteady. But just when Jake began to fear that they'd reached an impassable barrier, the passage opened into a natural cavern with a shaft of moonlight streaming down from an opening 30 feet above their heads. They had found a way out, but reaching the surface would require climbing skills and physical strength that Eleanor might not possess. Jake looked up at their salvation and realized that their escape would require the kind of desperate improvisation that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who had never failed him when everything was on the line. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder, and Jake knew they had minutes before Russo's men discovered their hiding place. The choice was simple: attempt a climb that might kill Eleanor, or stay in the cave and face certain death at the hands of criminals who could never afford to leave witnesses alive. Kaiser looked at Jake with the patient confidence of a partner who had shared impossible situations before, and Jake realized that their survival would depend on the same trust that had carried them through 18 months of combat operations together.